Welcome everyone to our 14th Lake Stewardship Workshop. As you know, I'm Jim Irwin, Chair of the Riding Mountain Biosphere Reserve. I'll be hosting tonight's workshop, and Dennis Hodgson and Daryl Kynes will be assisting. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Riding Mountain Biosphere Reserve is in Treaty 2 and 4 territories of the Anishinaabe people, and say that we respect and share their all-important teachings that water is a sacred gift essential for all life. Since 1986, Riding Mountain Biosphere Reserve has been bringing people together to share their knowledge for the well-being of our communities. In this respect, we are very pleased to have Chelsea Lobson share in this session of our Lake Stewardship workshops. Chelsea is the program director for the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. She received her Master's of Science degree from the University of Manitoba in 2018. Chelsea oversees the Lake Winnipeg Foundation program development in line with the organization's mission, with specific responsibility for the Lake Winnipeg community-based monitoring network, which you will be talking about tonight. She has managed the growth of the network since 2017, coordinating training and sampling activities, managing critical partnerships, and overseeing lab and data analyses and reporting. Chelsea's presentation is entitled Data for Decision Making, the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network. Chelsea?
Thanks for the introduction, Jim. My name is Chelsea, and I'm excited to be here today to talk about the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network. I want to begin by recognizing that Lake Winnipeg, the lake that we at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation are working to protect, is a part of the traditional territories of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Métis peoples, and this is a lake that has long been cared for by the people living on its shores. Now with that, I'm excited to get into more information on the Community-Based Monitoring Network, which is a network of citizen scientists and watershed partners working together to collect water samples for phosphorus testing in the Lake Winnipeg watershed. So just a little bit of background on the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. The Lake Winnipeg Foundation works to restore and protect the health of Lake Winnipeg by addressing the increasing frequency and severity of blue-green algae blooms that have been occurring on the lake for the last few decades. And we know from decades of whole ecosystem research at the experimental lakes area that phosphorus is the driver of these algae blooms. And so if we want to reduce algae blooms occurring on Lake Winnipeg and other lakes in Manitoba and across the world, we need to address the amount of phosphorus loading that's entering these lakes. So here you can see a photo from a famous study at the experimental lakes area where they cut a double basin lake in half. They added carbon and nitrogen on one side, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus on the other side. And of course, it was the side with phosphorus that had the algae blooms. Since this study, they've been doing more and more studies on phosphorus at different levels in different lakes, and they continue to see that phosphorus is the driver for blue-green algae blooms, and so we use this whole ecosystem research to address the blue-green algae blooms on Lake Winnipeg. With that in mind, we developed the Lake Winnipeg Health Plan, which is an 8-action health plan, with each action addressing one of the root causes of phosphorus loading to Lake Winnipeg. So for example, under Action 3 of the health plan, setting the standard for wastewater treatment, here we advocate for upgrades to wastewater treatment facilities for phosphorus reduction. Lately, our advocacy has been focused on upgrades to the North End treatment plant in Winnipeg, which is the single largest point source of phosphorus in the watershed. Under Action 6 of the health plan, promoting agricultural water stewardship, here we evaluate agricultural beneficial management practices for their phosphorus reduction capacity. Under Action 1 of the health plan, keeping water on the land, we advocate for the protection and restoration of wetlands, which we know are like the kidneys of the watershed, soaking up kind of all the nutrients before they end up in our lakes downstream. Under Action 4 of the health plan, monitoring our waterways, this is where we coordinate the Lake Winnipeg community-based monitoring network, what I'll be talking about this evening. And the reason that monitoring is an action to address phosphorus loading is because in order to address that phosphorus, we first need to know where it's coming from. So here you can see a map of the Lake Winnipeg watershed. And as many of you may know, it's huge, spanning 4 provinces from just west of Calgary to just west of Thunder Bay, dipping into 4 US states. And when we look at a map of the watershed like this, the challenges facing Lake Winnipeg can seem insurmountable. But the good news is that not all areas of the watershed are contributing the same amount of phosphorus. So if we can break the watershed down and identify regions which are contributing more phosphorus on average, we call those phosphorus hotspots, we can target our resources and remedial action to those hotspots in order to have an impact on Lake Winnipeg. Here's another map of the watershed broken down into the major drainage areas to the lake. So for example, this is the Red River, the Assiniboine River, the Winnipeg River system, the Saskatchewan River system, the smaller tributaries around the lake, which include Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipegosis. This is about the level of data that's shared in the State of Lake Winnipeg report, which is a report produced by the provincial and federal governments every few years. And it does a really great job of showing us what the major contributors of phosphorus are. So for example, we know from this report that the largest contributor of phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg is this Red and the Assiniboine watershed, which contributes about 70% of the total phosphorus load to the lake. So it's definitely a place to start. But even within this drainage area, there are lots of different land use types, lots of different topography. And so ideally, we would be able to break down these larger drainage areas even further and identify phosphorus hotspots with more precision. So that's exactly what the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network aims to do, which is complement federally and provincially collected data by breaking down these larger drainage areas into smaller pieces to more precisely identify phosphorus hotspots where remedial action can be targeted to have an impact on phosphorus loading to our lakes. So here you can see data from one of our sites, Rose Isle Creek, which is in southwestern Manitoba in the Boyne River watershed. On this chart, the blue line is water flow at the site, and the black dots are phosphorus concentration. So as you can see, there's a peak here at the beginning of the year. This is the spring melt, and this is when most of the phosphorus is running off the land and into our waterways. And as you can see, during this time, we have both high water flow and high phosphorus concentration. And we have another little peak here later in the spring. This was a rain event in late June. And we have another increase in water flow and increase in phosphorus concentration. So you can imagine that if this was a traditional monitoring program, which sampled quarterly and not based on events or water flow events, you could be missing these important runoff periods and be greatly underestimating the phosphorus loading from a site. And so what the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network does is it utilizes citizen scientists as a method to collect this frequent and responsive data because citizen scientists live, work, or commute near their sampling sites. They're able to collect samples frequently during the spring melt period and responsively to runoff events later in the season when the water is coming off the land and into our waterways and bringing with it the nutrients. And so, as you can gather from the last slide, water flow is an important aspect of the program along with phosphorus concentration. And so what you see on this photo is a Water Survey of Canada station where water flow data is collected. And there are stations like this kind of scattered all across southern Manitoba. They measure water flow and share it online in real time, which is great because this allows us to monitor the water flow online and mobilize our volunteers when a flow event is occurring and we need them to go collect a sample. Sometimes there aren't Water Survey of Canada stations exactly where we want to sample, but whenever possible, we do collect data from these sites because of that value added information we get from this data. In the Winnipeg River system, for example, where we don't have a lot of Water Survey of Canada stations, we partner with groups like Manitoba Hydro and Ontario Power Generation to collect that flow data to go with our phosphorus data. And I know some of the much smaller drainage areas don't have water survey stations, like those tributaries going into Sandy Lake, for example, but I know folks like Daryl are keen to kind of get that flow data to go along with the phosphorus data. Other than being able to monitor it in real time and kind of know when to mobilize volunteers, it's also really important because it allows us to calculate phosphorus loads. So the concentration tells us the amount of phosphorus in a water sample, but we need the flow to know how much water is going by the site so that we can multiply those two things together and know the actual amount of phosphorus running by the sample site. So that tells us the amount of phosphorus in kilograms or in tons being contributed by a waterway. And just one more little bit of math for you guys. When we have the phosphorus load, we can also divide that by the drainage area and get the phosphorus export. And this is the amount of phosphorus being contributed by each hectare of land in a drainage area. So you can think of this as kind of like a yield in agriculture, but instead of the amount of wheat being contributed by an area of land, it's the amount of phosphorus being contributed by an area of land. And so this allows us to compare waterways with different size drainage areas and compare their phosphorus contributions that way. And so with that, here's a map of our phosphorus exports from 2019. As you can see, we have a decent coverage of southern Manitoba and the Red River Valley here. We have expanded into the Winnipeg River system and parts of the watershed like the White Mud watershed, the Dauphin Lake watershed. We have the Pembina Valley covered pretty well, as well as parts of the Souris River. And as you can see in 2019, we were able to identify phosphorus hotspots. Lots of these hotspots are located in the southeastern portion of the province. And this is a region where we've continuously been identifying phosphorus hotspots kind of since we began this program in 2016. So we're very confident that this is an area that needs to be addressed in order to have an impact on the algae blooms on Lake Winnipeg. But we've also identified previously hotspots in the Pembina River, the LaSalle River watersheds. And this data is at a scale of the entire watershed, but partners in like the Dauphin Lake watershed, they can use this data to kind of look at all the tributaries that are going into Dauphin Lake and see which is contributing the most phosphorus per area and which tributary do we want to focus on in order to reduce the phosphorus load to the lake. So even though relative to these southeastern hotspots, they might not be as red on the map, but that data can still be kind of broken down regionally to identify hotspots on a more local scale. Oftentimes I have gotten asked questions because in some of these drainage areas that are green, for example, like Swan Lake in the Pembina Valley area, this site actually often pops up very bright green on the map and is often a drainage area of the Pembina River that's sequestering phosphorus. But we hear from folks who use that lake that, it's green on this map, but we are experiencing algae blooms all the time on this lake. And so some sites are kind of, some lakes are sequestering phosphorus and kind of retaining it, which is causing algae blooms on those lakes. But what we can do for those sites and the way that we can use this data is by looking upstream of of those lakes and identifying the hotspots in the watershed kind of upstream of there. So if this is the Swan Lake watershed, we can look at the tributaries of the Pembina. Oh, I'm using the wrong screen. If this is the Swan Lake watershed, we can look at the tributaries of the Pembina River upstream of that site and see, have we been able to identify any hotspots? What's contributing the most phosphorus? Where should we target our remedial action? And that's kind of how we recommend using this data. So here is our phosphorus export map from 2018. And as you can see, it looks really different than the 2019 map. We did grow the program between 2018 and 2019, so there's less coverage on this map. But you'll also notice that it's completely green. So there was really low phosphorus loading, low phosphorus exports from all of our sites monitored in 2018. And that's because 2018 was a really dry year. And so as we know from those equations, phosphorus loading is a product of the concentration times the water flow. And in 2018, there was really low water flow from all of our sampling sites, and this resulted in low phosphorus loading. And so even though this data wasn't great from 2018 for identifying phosphorus hotspots in the watershed, it did allow us to talk about the importance of phosphorus, of water flow in driving phosphorus loading, and talk about the potential of kind of mimicking these low phosphorus loading conditions in wetter years by holding water on the land in protected wetlands or in permanent water storage solutions in order to reduce the phosphorus loading occurring from the watershed. Another important thing that our 2018 data highlights is that long-term monitoring is really important. So if this was a one-year research study and we looked at the phosphorus loading from the watershed, we would have had a really skewed view of kind of what regions are contributing phosphorus in the watershed, and might not even think there's a phosphorus problem in the Lake Winnipeg watershed. So we really need multiple years of data and long-term data sets in order to understand that interannual variation and understand how different climate situations can impact the lake and phosphorus loading. And so with that, as some of you might know, with climate change on the prairies, we are expecting more unpredictable weather patterns. And this is another thing that really highlights the benefit of having a nimble and responsive network of citizen scientists who live, work, or commute near their sampling site and can grab a sample when it's most important. In the fall of 2019, we actually saw these huge increases in flow. You might remember that the Winnipeg floodway was open that fall, which I think was unprecedented for fall conditions. And so as you can see on this chart, again, the blue is the water flow and the black is the concentration. In the fall, we saw higher flows than in the spring, and we did see phosphorus concentrations increase during that time too, not quite to spring peak concentrations, but still higher than baseline. And since we had volunteers kind of on the ground ready to sample, we were able to capture this event and have an understanding now of what these fall rain events and flow events, how that might impact phosphorus loading in the future, and if events like these become more common. Another thing that highlighted the benefit of a nimble and responsive network of volunteers was last spring when the pandemic hit Manitoba at the same time as the spring melt occurred, basically about 1 year ago now. And while it wasn't safe for many centralized monitoring organizations to go out and collect data because the citizen scientists are near their site, and it's an area that they spend a lot of time. It's kind of a solitary activity that's done with a household going out to the sampling site and collecting that data. And so we were able to adapt our protocols and have volunteers continue to collect that data, even though there was this global pandemic going on. And that allowed us to collect data in 2020 when lots of other centralized groups weren't able to collect data. So hopefully we don't have any more of these, but any more pandemics, but it did highlight the benefit of the network for sure. And one of the most exciting things about the program is how the data is being used. So this program was designed to identify phosphorus hotspots where resources and remedial action can be targeted. We would want folks like the Manitoba Habitat and Heritage Corporation or Environment and Climate Change Canada's Lake Winnipeg Basin program to use our maps to target their resources to regions where they'll have the greatest impact. And we've also seen this kind of go in the other directions where watershed districts and other partners who are applying for funding from these organizations can say that, you know, this is an area in our region that has been identified as a hotspot by the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network. And so if you fund our project that is in kind of an area that needs addressing, you'll get a better return on investment than other projects. And so it's been used kind of in the application process as well, which is really cool. Another great thing is that we've been partnering with universities who are doing fieldwork and are using our data to target their fieldwork to where it'll have the greatest impact on phosphorus reduction. So for example, we have partners at the University of Winnipeg who are doing a soil science project about a soil amendment that might reduce phosphorus loading from flooded soils in the spring. And they wanted to do their fieldwork kind of in a hot spot with a soil that has a high soil test phosphorus in order to ensure that, you know, if this works, it works in the areas that we need it most. And so we're really grateful for those partnerships with the universities as well. And one of the ways that the data is being used that we were not expecting is by watershed modelers. And so folks in the modeling world, you might have heard that your modeling outcome is only as good as the data that you have going into that model. And so lots of groups, once this data became available, were really excited to have this frequent and responsive phosphorus data set that they can feed into their models in order to have more accurate predictions coming from those models. And so we've heard from groups at Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, who use this data in their models. And actually, in some cases, where they are developing watershed models to predict where hotspots might be, they actually use the community-based monitoring network data as like a ground truth for their model outcomes. And so they consider the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network data to be like the truth. And if their hotspots kind of match up with ours, then that's like a positive outcome from their model. And so it's pretty cool when citizen collected data is being used as the truth in a government modeling initiative. And I think it really speaks to the quality of the data that's being collected by the folks in this network. And we're really excited to be using the data to inform other actions of the health plan now. So for example, we've used it in communications with the setting the standard for wastewater treatment action. So when we were doing advocacy for upgrades to the wastewater treatment in Winnipeg, we're presenting that the wastewater in Winnipeg contributes 5% of the total phosphorus load to Lake Winnipeg. And so this is a point source. It's coming from one pipe. We really need to address it. But the pushback that we got from people was, well, 5%, what about the other 95% of phosphorus? What are we going to do about that? But we use the community-based monitoring network data to really debunk that myth of the other 95%. Even when we look to watershed sources of phosphorus, we see like 1% coming from a hotspot on the eastern side, 2.2% coming from a hotspot on the western side, and so 5% coming from one pipe in the city that we know how to address. That's the biggest kind of single source of phosphorus that we have and that we can address immediately. And so just using the community-based monitoring network data to highlight the importance of what that 5% means and why it's worth addressing. And then we're also using the data to inform Action 6, which is an emerging program for the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, promoting agricultural water stewardship. And so here we have Julie DePau, the agricultural water stewardship coordinator at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, evaluating phosphorus beneficial management practices in the watershed for their phosphorus reduction impact. And so lots of the beneficial management practices that we do here in Manitoba are actually imported from places with different climate, different landscapes. And so we need to evaluate them here in Manitoba to make sure that they are in fact effective at addressing phosphorus loading. So for example, in something that kind of makes Manitoba a little bit different than the more southern places where these beneficial management practices are studied, is that the snowmelt is the primary contributor of phosphorus loading to the lakes. If your beneficial management practice is something that doesn't capture that snowmelt, then it's probably not going to be effective at addressing the phosphorus loading in our watershed. And also beneficial management practices that are focused on hillier regions aren't as effective here necessarily in our really flat topography of the Red River Valley and kind of the rest of southern Manitoba. And so testing these things here in all sorts of different parts of Manitoba is really important. And you can see she's monitoring water retention projects right now at the inflows and the outflows to see how much phosphorus they are reducing. And this is just a little bit of a smaller watershed scale than community-based monitoring. So here you can see the Red River Valley outline, and these are the CBM drainage areas in the colors. And then this little pink region here, this is a agriculture and water stewardship site. So just breaking down those drainage areas even further to kind of identify what's going on with the phosphorus loading in these sites. And we're really excited for 2021 because we are going to continue to grow the program. In 2020, while our current volunteers were able to collect water samples, we weren't comfortable, meeting volunteers to train them in the field. But now we know a lot more about COVID, not phosphorus. We know a lot more about COVID, so we can safely train volunteers outdoors with masks at an appropriate distance and continue to grow the program, which is really exciting. So we are adding a lot more sites in the Assiniboine River watershed, which you might have noticed had some gaps in that 2019 map. So we have lots of sites, or a few sites in the Little Saskatchewan River watershed, a lot more sites in the Souris River watershed. We actually have added our first site on the US side of the Souris River, which will complement our data collected in that southwestern portion of the province really well. And then we've also added some extra sites in the Winnipeg River system in partnership with Ontario Power Generation. And of course, we're excited to add and engage with more citizen scientists who are taking on lots of these sites. I've seen a few on this call that I'm excited to meet and get them their equipment. And we are going to also be continuing a partnership that we started last year with the University of Manitoba to collect salinity data with all of our phosphorus data. And so the Stress Ecology Lab at the University of Manitoba is interested in doing a landscape scan of salinity runoff from southern Manitoba. And so they've kind of recognized the value of the infrastructure that this network has with all the volunteers and partners on the ground who can collect this data frequently and responsively. And so they've added a vial into each of our sample packs and they'll be able to measure salinity from that vial. And so salts run off at the same time as nutrients during that spring melt period and after rain events. They're applied to roads to de-ice them. They're in agricultural fertilizer, and they're also naturally occurring. So it'll be really interesting to see the kind of data that they get from that study. I think it's the first of its kind in Manitoba. Our program was also highlighted in a report that was recently released called 5 Things the Federal Government Must Do for Lake Winnipeg. So there's a lot of discussion about water at the federal level right now with regard to the development of a Canada Water Agency. And the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, in partnership with the Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective, identified 5 things that the federal government could do with legislation that's available right now that could have an immediate impact on Lake Winnipeg and the watershed. So while it is focused on Lake Winnipeg, lots of the recommendations in this report are focused on the watershed. It does include the use of community-based monitoring data by the federal government to target resources. And so that is under thing 2 of the 5 things. So I definitely recommend taking a read of that on our website if you are interested in federal advocacy around water. And we also want to release the data in a timely manner. So in most years, other than 2020, because of the pandemic, all our data is released prior to the next field season so that it's available in decision-making processes or project planning for that following year. And so you can find all of our regional reports that are organized by watershed district on our website. And this just goes into a little bit more detail on the region and the data that's being collected, as well as not just that year's data, but kind of all the data that's been collected from that region. So I definitely recommend taking a look at these regional reports if you have a specific area that you're interested in. And with that, yeah, I just recommend going to our website for more information. That's where you'll find all of our regional reports, as well as our network level reports that are released each year. Lake Winnipeg Data Stream has our data. It's a really awesome portal for kind of looking around and seeing what data is out there. You can also find the community-based monitoring data along with provincial and federally collected data, as well as other organization data. And it's all sorts of different parameters on water. So if you have an area that you're interested in, you can kind of zoom in on their map and see what's been collected in your area or what is being collected in your area. So it's a really great tool for that, and not just downloading the raw data, but visualization tools, and you can make charts and things by just clicking different buttons. So it's quite fun to play around with. And my email's up here as well. So feel free to email me if you're wondering how you could get involved in sampling, or you have any questions about this presentation or anything you find on our website. And with that, I'm happy to take any other questions that folks might have.
So well done, Chelsea. Couple of questions here. One, I guess, is how do you go about recruiting volunteers to collect samples?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Dennis. So we recruit volunteers in all sorts of ways. One of the most successful ways is by partnering with the watershed districts in Manitoba. So we have really great partnerships with almost all of the watershed districts, and they have really strong community connections and happen to know like landowners or community members who might live near the Water Survey of Canada station. So we work with them to recruit volunteers. We also have like a lot of environmental science students who are interested in kind of getting some field experience for their resume. So they'll take on a site and go out and do sampling. And I know we call them citizen scientists, but we also have a lot of folks who are like retired people with serious science backgrounds who do this sampling as well. And so it's all sorts of different people. We have schools who participate as well, which is really great too when we can see students getting out there. So there's lots of different ways that we recruit, and community presentations like this are great for that too. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, what a great way for youth to learn the stewardship of water and soil. How do you go about training these volunteers, Chelsea?
Yeah, so whenever possible, we do an in the field training. So we'll meet someone at their site and go over the equipment with them, go over the protocol. Sometimes because the spring melt is the most important time for sampling, sometimes that has to occur when the water is still ice covered, since we want people to be kind of ready for that melt period. And sometimes the watershed districts also do that training for us when they're able to. So that's great too.
Maybe we're going to have a lesser impact of phosphorus loading this spring, given the little amount of snow that we have in some parts. Do you think that's going to be so?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say what's going to happen with rain events this year, but the snow melt, it started and then was pretty much done. So we have seen basically baseline flows at a lot of our sites that are usually peaking around this time. So it's going to be an interesting year for sure in terms of phosphorus loading, and hopefully we get some rain so that other issues aren't impacted, like agriculture and stuff though too. It's a little bit concerning out there, but we'll see what happens with the rain events later in the year.
I like your comment about the citizen data and the whole theory behind it. And I guess it maybe speaks to the next question here. Is one-time data or sampling collected, or even collected rather infrequently over a period of years, is it really very valuable compared to doing a regular monitoring such as this?
I would say it's better than nothing. Like having those, having that data would be better than not knowing anything. But with nutrients, and especially phosphorus, it's really important to be sampling during those runoff periods, because if you are not sampling during the spring melt or when those peaks happen later on in the year, you're going to be really underestimating the phosphorus. And in certain cases, if you only sample during the peak and apply that to the whole season, then you're going to be overestimating the phosphorus. And so it is really important to have that event-based sampling. But as you can imagine, like if you were a centralized organization trying to collect all of that responsive data, it would be nearly impossible. If there was a rain event across the province, how could someone go out and collect all of that data in like 24 hours or 48 hours? And so I think citizen scientists are really the key to kind of getting this frequent and responsive data that otherwise would have been impossible. It's almost like having an employee like on call near a sampling site at all times, which just wouldn't happen otherwise, right? So I think using this kind of method to collect phosphorus data is key to collecting that really robust phosphorus data.
Yeah, if it's so useful and practical for the Winnipeg Lake Foundation to do this, then it surely must be useful for a lake community to develop a data strategy initiative.
Yeah, I think this could be done by anyone. The limiting factor is the flow data in a lot of cases. So making sure you have that flow data to go with the phosphorus data. But I know that's something that you guys are working on for Sandy Lake, which is really great. And I think in terms of data strategies, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that you're collecting data that you have an idea of how you're going to use it. So not just collecting data for data's sake, but having a specific question in mind that you're trying to answer. So for us, it was like, where is the phosphorus coming from? That's what we're trying to figure out. For you, it might be the same, but making sure that you have a use for that data, and that can inform then data analysis and how you're presenting the data, which is how you get kind of others to understand the data and kind of have that full circle of the data feeding into policy and being useful.
This may be a good place to talk a bit about the actual testing process, the analysis process, and can communities do that, or does it need to be done in a lab?
I think it would be pretty difficult to have the infrastructure at home to analyze these samples. There are harmful chemicals that are used in the process that need to be stored appropriately. So I would recommend using a lab to do this. We partner with labs to do our analysis. In previous years, we've done this analysis ourselves, but we're really excited to be partnering with the University of Winnipeg this year to have a student actually analyze the samples for us. So that'll be a great new partnership and hopefully free up some of our time to do more volunteer recruitment and training and reporting and things like that.
How often should the sampling be done in a melt or a major rain event, Chelsea?
Yeah, so it depends on the size of the watershed a little bit. We say for the majority of sites that we sample at, about 3 times per week during the spring melt period. And then once that's over and we get to baseline conditions, if the site still has flow, lots of small streams or drains actually dry up completely during the summer. But if the site does still have flow, then sampling once every 2 weeks during that baseline period. And then of course, collecting a sample if there is a rain event that results in an increase in flow later on in the season. Now, for some really small watersheds, like for example, the retention ponds that my colleague Julie samples at, she needs to be sampling a little bit more frequently just because the drainage area is so small that the time that the rain takes to kind of trickle through is so short that you need to kind of be sampling almost every day to make sure you're catching that. But for most creeks and rivers that the CBM program is sampling at 3 times a week during the spring melt, and then bi-weekly or in response to rain events after that.
One of our friends here is saying that we're interested in finding and tracking phosphorus levels in tributaries of Sandy Lake. Can we join with you to set up a monitoring program and get advice on how and when to take measurements?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's something that we've been talking about a lot, and we're excited to partner with you folks on that monitoring of Sandy Lake. And one of the biggest hurdles for the small lake monitoring is often the flow data. So having that's going to be really key, and I'm glad that you guys kind of recognize that and are working on getting the equipment necessary to collect that flow data so that we can kind of measure the loads and have the exports and understand which tributaries are contributing the most phosphorus.
Is there a training video on this topic?
Yeah, there is a training video, like in terms of our protocol. We go through that on our YouTube. We have a video that was actually released this year. I don't know exactly what our YouTube is, but I think you can find it on our website, or you could just search Lake Winnipeg Foundation on YouTube and you could find our account.
Another question, in addition to phosphorus levels, do you collect any data at all on nitrate, ammonia, and E. coli levels? If not, why not?
We don't collect that data. We are focused on phosphorus because that's what causes the algae blooms on Lake Winnipeg and other lakes in Manitoba. And we when we think about other parameters and stuff, we're just cautious about taking too much on and not doing the full data analysis and data reporting and making sure that we are completing that data to policy cycle where the data is not only collected, but it's being analyzed and reported on in a timely manner. And we have a reason for monitoring phosphorus, and so that makes that whole kind of circle really easy. We would partner with someone like, say, an academic was interested in adding a bottle for nitrogen analysis. We'd be happy to kind of do that in partnership with someone else who did want and had a plan for that nitrogen data, like we're doing with the salinity data. But we aren't really interested in nitrogen data necessarily, just because it doesn't relate to algae blooms the same way, or it doesn't drive algae blooms the same way phosphorus does. And so that's why we've chosen to kind of pick one thing that we're really good at and do a good job of it with phosphorus.
What are if a lake community were going to start collecting data, what would be the devices and the means or the data that they would want to collect?
Well, that would depend on the challenges that are facing that lake community. If you're worried about algae blooms, I would focus on phosphorus loading into the lake. If you're worried about invasive species, you might want to have a different monitoring approach for that. But the devices that are used for the sampling process, it's pretty simple. We actually make our own water samplers out of a PVC pipe with cement in the bottom. So it's a weighted device that can sample through the stream. And that's kind of all you need to collect the samples. And we provide that, if you signed on to be a citizen scientist or to partner with the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network, all of that equipment is provided for each site. But I would make sure that you have enough equipment for each individual sampling site. You really don't want to be moving equipment from site to site, because that can transfer aquatic invasive species, which none of us want to do. So having either a method of cleaning it in between or discrete equipment for each site is really important.
So is one of the biggest tasks for a community, a lake community, to determine in which are the significant runs, waterways coming into the lake?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, our program doesn't do this, but there are also concerns about internal loading of phosphorus, which you would use different methods to analyze. You have to analyze some other parameters as well, such as like understanding if the bottom of the lake is anoxic, which can release phosphorus from the sediment. So that might be an important thing for a small lake to understand. But I do think even if you have an internal phosphorus loading problem, you still want to stop the inflow of phosphorus. Otherwise, that problem is just going to keep occurring and keep occurring. And so I think, yeah, focusing on the tributaries and understanding which tributaries might be like hotspots, and if there are hotspots, that kind of makes the job a little bit easier, because then you don't have to focus on the whole watershed. You kind of have an area to direct your resources and remedial action towards to improve the lake. And once you have that hotspot, you can kind of continue to drill down into that region and try to figure out what's going on, where the phosphorus is coming from, etc.
You touched on a very interesting part. I think we all understand a little bit about the external loading, but I don't know that very many of us understand a whole lot about what's going on internally relative to the sediment and its interface with the water column.
Yeah, and I shouldn't have brought that up, because I actually don't know a ton about it either. That's not something that our program does. We don't do in-lake sampling, so we do only sample at waterways like flowing rivers or streams or tributaries. But I do know enough to know that there's something going on with the anoxic bottom that can release phosphorus into the water column, and so that is something to look out for. But I'm sure you've had other people on for these webinars that would be able to speak to that a little better than I could.
Oh, can you speak a little bit about the testing and analysis portion of your program, Chelsea? Like, how long does it take, and where do the samples go, and what do they need to come to you in? What are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the samples come to us in sample bottles. So first, at the beginning of the year, we send all the equipment out. So these little sample packs that have all the bottles necessary for one sample kind of in a pack. And those bottles have a little bit of sulfuric acid in them, and that will preserve the sample so that it's, once it's collected, it's stable, and you don't need to like ship it in the next day, or it doesn't need to be, analyzed within 24 hours or anything like that. So once the sample is collected, we would usually suggest that the volunteer kind of collect a bunch before we make plans to come grab them. And we do that kind of a few times throughout the year in bunches. But once we get the bottles back, we will send them to the lab, which is a new partnership we have with the University of Winnipeg. So they are getting an automatic auto analyzer for phosphorus analysis, which will make the process hopefully a lot quicker. And then we take this data, and the lab data is matched up with our metadata in our database. And the metadata is everything that the volunteer collects with the water sample. So you have your sample, but you need to know the date that it was collected, the time it was collected, who collected it, any observations from the field that might impact what we're seeing, any deviations from the protocol that might have occurred for whatever reason. So this is all really important information that goes with the water sample. And so we check all that, and it gets matched with the lab data in our database. And then for data that's going into our reports, we analyze the data, do quality checks on it, combine it with the water flow data to calculate the phosphorus loads and exports. And then all of this data goes into a regional report based on the watershed district region that the data was collected in. And then these reports are released once a year at our annual gathering in February, where all volunteers and partners and funders and data users are invited, and there's presentations where our data is presented along with other groups doing similar work. And so the data is released at that time in these reports, as well as released onto DataStream. And we do have a few partnerships kind of outside of the data that we put into regional reports. So for example, with the Sandy Lake group, if we get your lab data back, we can kind of provide you with that data as we receive it. It might not necessarily, we might not wait until that February period when we're sharing our analyzed and reported on data.
And that was another question, I guess, is it possible to generate reports on a kind of a micro watershed basis or on a lake community basis even? Yeah,
we could share the data with you kind of as we receive it from the lab, but we would also want that kind of, you know, for our own purposes, we would want that the flow data you're collecting as well, kind of in exchange to do the lab and the data analysis with our science advisors, just to see kind of what's going on with that watershed too, and maybe we can make some recommendations as well and work with you guys on that process to help understand what's going on, and not just be sharing the raw data, but also kind of helping with the analysis and putting the data into context.
Is it possible for a community then to doing this kind of regime? Is it possible for them to develop data that could be used in decisions about how to use an aeration system, whether we're going to circulate with it or whether it's a full-blown aeration required, or just going to circulate water in the top layer of the lake, so to speak?
Yeah, I would be hesitant to speak about aeration systems. I don't know a lot about them and how effective they are at reducing algae blooms. I'm guessing the goal is to reduce that anoxic region at the bottom. And yeah, I wouldn't want to make any recommendations on that. And I'm not sure exactly how the external loading would impact whether you would use an aeration system or not. Like if you are able to identify a hotspot in the watershed, or you can kind of get a better idea of where in the watershed the phosphorus is coming from, you could have maybe a little bit more trust that you can do something about the algae blooms, and then maybe would decide against the aeration system. But I don't know enough about how effective those aeration systems are at reducing the algae blooms to make a strong recommendation on that.
I think the question was more intended to, could you use it as a management decision-making tool, perhaps, if all of a sudden you found that, we're kicking off a lot of phosphorus here from sediment, then maybe we need to slow down or shut down aeration type of thing, like just using it as a bit of a management tool.
Yeah, and yeah, for Sandy Lake, it's interesting. I know it doesn't have an outflow. So if there was an outflow on the lake, I would say you could kind of see what's coming in, see what's going out. see if the aeration system increases what's going out. But again, with some in-lake sampling, you might be able to also just assess what the aeration system is doing to those in-lake concentrations. But our program does focus on the flowing water tributaries. So
yeah. So once community's data or lake data identifies a hotspot, what education or what remediation do you or can you provide to the stakeholders in that geographic area then?
Yeah, so firstly, like the community-based monitoring network program is designed to collect like baseline data from sites. So we're kind of identifying where the phosphorus is coming from, but our data doesn't necessarily tell us like why the phosphorus or what the source of that phosphorus is. That's kind of where we would want to partner with like academics to drill down into those hotspots a little bit more. You can do like mapping and things to kind of infer what's going on at a site. So looking at the different potential sources and then kind of teasing those apart and seeing what each of those might be contributing. But in terms of beneficial management practices, once you do identify a hotspot, we're still learning a lot about like what is effective here in Manitoba at reducing phosphorus loading. And so hopefully some of the work from our agricultural water stewardship program will start to point towards some of these solutions and which ones are the most effective in different landscapes, because so many of these beneficial management practices are imported, like retention ponds and things like that, buffer strips, for example. We don't know like how effective they're going to be here in Manitoba.
You've probably kind of answered the next question here, I think, but have you been able to use your phosphorus data to track source back to individual farms or situations and encouraged the owners of that property or enterprise to implement best management practices to reduce phosphorus escape into the flowing water?
No, so we haven't been able to do that, and a lot of it is because of the scale of a lot of the sites that we sample at for the community-based monitoring network. So one of those little hotspots is still like hundreds of hectares in size. So there's lots of different landowners in that area, lots of different practices going on, mixtures of urban like sewage release or lagoon effluent with agriculture. And so it would be really difficult to kind of point fingers at one landowner. And I don't know if that's necessarily the goal of the program, to kind of point fingers, but to identify hotspots where work and remedial action and resources can be targeted to reduce the phosphorus loading kind of at the watershed scale.
That's about the end of the questions, Chelsea. You've done a marvelous job. It was a very interesting presentation and a great job on the answers here. And to the participants, thank you for all of the questions. You've been a great crew tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all the great questions. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, Chelsea, and the great job you did on answering the questions. And thank you, Dennis, for assisting with the Q&A. So in closing, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. All the best to you and your families, and we hope you will join us next week.